The sound of children's laughter reverberated through the air like a forgotten melody. Alexander Morgan stopped dead in his tracks as he crossed the threshold to the back terrace of his mansion. The Italian leather briefcase he held in his right hand suddenly felt excessively heavy, as if it contained all the responsibilities he had accumulated over the years. His children, the twins Matthew and Daniel, were splashing in the pool amid crystalline giggles. But what truly paralyzed Alexander was the image of the woman with them. It wasn't the German governess he had hired with impeccable credentials, but the new housekeeper, Catherine Sullivan, hired barely 2 weeks ago. The woman was sitting at the edge of the pool, with her uniform sleeves rolled up and her feet submerged in the water, narrating something that provoked a joy in the children that he had never managed to awaken. "Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves end up becoming our own prison," he thought, as he observed the scene, feeling a contradictory mixture of gratitude and resentment at that intrusion into the meticulous order of his home. "Dad's here," whispered Daniel, the more perceptive of the twins, causing the laughter to cease instantly. Catherine stood up immediately, drying her feet with nervous movements. Her eyes, the color of freshly brewed coffee, momentarily met Alexander's before she lowered her gaze respectfully. "I apologize, Mr. Morgan." The children had finished their homework, and with the afternoon heat, Alexander raised a hand, interrupting her. His children's expressions had gone from happiness to wariness in a matter of seconds, and that change, that instantaneous transformation, was like a silent dagger that plunged into the deepest part of his being. When had he become the intruder in his own children's joys? "It's fine," he said in a controlled voice, that neutral and professional tone he used in boardrooms and in his own home alike. "But remember that supervising my children's recreational activities is not your function." The twins silently got out of the water, wrapped in towels that Catherine handed them with maternal gestures. The domesticity of the scene was strangely painful for Alexander. He vaguely remembered a time before Emily's death when the sound of children's laughter wasn't a rarity in that house. When everyone had left, Alexander remained alone by the pool. The water, now still, reflected a sky that was beginning to be tinged with the colors of sunset. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to remember the sound of his children's laughter. It had been 5 years since he had last heard them laugh like that. 5 years of emotional silence since Emily left forever. That night in the solitude of his office, reviewing million-dollar contracts with his usual meticulousness, Alexander couldn't push away the image of the housekeeper, with her simple uniform and easy smile, effortlessly achieving what he, with all his financial empire, hadn't managed in years, making Matthew and Daniel happy. Alexander Morgan's life could be measured in figures and achievements. At 42, he had built one of the most prosperous real estate groups in the city, transforming the modest family business into an empire valued in the millions. His buildings rose like monuments of glass and steel on the urban horizon, a tangible testimony to his vision and tenacity. Every morning he followed the same routine with military precision. He would rise at 5:30, train for an hour in his mansion's gym, have breakfast punctually at 6:45 while reviewing the first financial news on his tablet, and at 7:30 his driver, Robert, would be waiting to take him to the central offices of Morgan Developments. "Good morning, sir," greeted Diana Vasquez, his assistant for the past 8 years, as she handed him the day's itinerary printed on high-quality paper, just as he preferred. "The board meeting is scheduled for 9 Bose, Mr. Harrison has requested a few minutes with you beforehand." Alexander nodded slightly. Frank Harrison, his partner since the beginning, was brilliant with numbers, but impatient with people, a combination that Alexander tolerated out of necessity rather than affinity. "Tell him to see me at 8:30, he responded as he entered his office, a minimalist design space with windows that dominated the city. On the main wall hung a single painting, a geometric abstraction in blue and grey tones that Emily had chosen during their first anniversary. "It's like you," she had told him then, orderly on the surface, but with a depth that few bother to discover. Now, 5 years after her departure, Alexander wondered if any of that depth remained, or if he had become completely surface, appearance, the impeccable facade he presented to the world. The meeting with Frank transpired with the usual tension. The international expansion project in Latin America presented complications that Alexander had foreseen, but that Frank had dismissed as excessive pessimism. "The properties in Monterey have legal problems that weren't detected in the initial audit," explained Frank, avoiding Alexander's direct gaze. "It could delay us 3 months, maybe more." "I warned you about the need for a second legal opinion," Alexander replied without raising his voice, which made his reproach more intimidating. "What corrective measures have you implemented?" The conversation continued in those professional terms, with neither of them mentioning what was really at stake: the eroded trust after years of small discrepancies that had accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river, imperceptibly altering its course. Upon returning home that afternoon earlier than usual, Alexander found the twins in the study room with the governess, Miss Hoffman, a woman of rigid gestures and unquestionable efficiency. Matthew and Daniel, at 7 years old, worked silently at their respective desks, without the spark of vitality he had witnessed the day before by the pool. "How have they behaved today?" Alexander asked the governess in the hallway, after briefly greeting his children. "As always, Mr. Morgan. Matthew has improved in mathematics, though he still resists reading. Daniel continues to be excessively dreamy. He gets distracted easily." Alexander nodded, absorbing the information as he absorbed financial reports. Data to process, problems to solve. He had hired the best educator available. Wasn't that enough? During dinner, served punctually at 7 in the evening, he tried to establish a conversation with the twins. "What did you learn today?" he asked, using the same formula as always. "History," Matthew responded mechanically. "The Tudor and Stuart dynasties." "Very good," said Alexander, feeling the artificiality of the interaction. "And you, Daniel?" The twin, with dreamy eyes, so physically similar to his brother but so different in spirit, looked up from his plate. "Catherine told us that in her village there's a legend about a fountain that grants wishes if you throw a coin while thinking of someone you love." Alexander frowned, disconcerted by the mention of the housekeeper. "When did you speak with Catherine?" "She came to clean the library while we were studying," Daniel replied cautiously. "Miss Hoffman stepped out for a moment, and she told us stories about her village." An uncomfortable silence settled in the dining room. Alexander was torn between irritation at the employee's intrusion and curiosity to know more about that exchange that had captured his most reserved son's attention. "Miss Hoffman is here to educate you according to the program we've established," he finally said. "Folk stories are entertaining, but they don't substitute formal education." The twins returned to their plates without responding. The rest of the dinner passed in silence, barely interrupted by the tinkling of silverware against the fine porcelain. That night, while reviewing documents in his office, Alexander heard a soft melody coming from the service wing. Guided by curiosity, he silently approached until he identified the source. Catherine was singing quietly while ironing school uniforms. The lyrics spoke of a lost and found love, of distances that only the heart could travel. For an instant, Alexander allowed himself to listen, recognizing in that voice a warmth that had been absent from his life for too long. Catherine Sullivan had learned since childhood that life rarely followed the expected paths. At 34, she would never have imagined that she would end up cleaning the mansion of one of the most powerful men in the country, after having been a university professor and recognized writer in her homeland. That morning, as she meticulously organized Mr. Morgan's library, an imposing room with oak shelves that reached the ceiling, her thoughts traveled between the uncertain present and the lost past. The earthquake that had devastated her region had not only taken her home and possessions, but also the manuscripts she had worked on for years. Now, every move in her life was calculated to rebuild a stability that had crumbled between her fingers like dry sand. "What are you doing?" The child's voice startled her. Daniel Morgan was observing her from the door with that intense and curious look that distinguished him from his brother. "I'm organizing your father's books," Catherine replied with a smile. "You should be in your classes, little one." "Miss Hoffman is talking on the phone," explained Daniel, approaching. "Her eyes are red. I think she's been crying." Catherine nodded, storing that information. She had noticed that the governess seemed particularly tense in recent days. "Do you like books, Daniel?" she asked, changing the subject. The boy shrugged, a surprisingly adult gesture in his childish body. "I like stories, but I don't like reading. Miss Hoffman says I have concentration problems." "I had them too at your age," confessed Catherine, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Do you know what helped me? imagining that each book was a door to a different world. I didn't read words, I crossed thresholds. The boy's eyes momentarily lit up. Catherine recognized in that fleeting spark something of herself, of her own childhood, marked by difficulties she had overcome through imagination and perseverance. "What kind of stories do you like?" asked Daniel, coming closer. "Those that speak of normal people who do extraordinary things," Catherine responded while continuing to organize the books. "I believe that true magic is in people, not in spells or supernatural powers." Their conversation was interrupted by the hurried arrival of Miss Hoffman, whose severe expression hardened even more upon finding Daniel in the library. "Young Daniel, I've been looking for you. Your study period is not over," she said in a cutting tone before directing a disapproving look at Catherine. "And you, Miss Sullivan, must limit yourself to your cleaning tasks without distracting the children." "I'm sorry, Miss Hoffman," Catherine responded with calculated humility. "Young Daniel was just asking me some questions about the organization of the books." The governess didn't seem convinced, but she limited herself to taking Daniel by the arm to lead him back to the study room. Later, during her lunch break in the small room designated for the service staff, Catherine became better acquainted with the other employees of the mansion. Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper who had been in the Morgan service for 15 years, was an inexhaustible source of information. "The master wasn't always like this, so distant," commented Mrs. Jenkins as they shared a coffee. "When Mrs. Emily was alive, this house was different. There was music, gatherings, laughter. The children were barely 2 years old when she fell ill, but she was a wonderful mother." "What did she fall ill with?" asked Catherine with genuine interest. "A fulminant cancer," responded Mrs. Jenkins, lowering her voice although they were alone. "It took her in less than 3 months. The master never recovered. He threw himself into work, hired specialists for the children, established strict routines. As if trying to control the uncontrollable. Catherine assimilated this information in silence. The family tragedy explained much about the atmosphere of that mansion, the cold perfection, the emotional distance, the obsessive order as a barrier against the chaos of pain. "The twins are good boys," continued Mrs. Jenkins, "but they need more than tutors and schedules. They need to know that it's okay to be children, to laugh, even to make mischief from time to time." "I noticed," said Catherine, "they seem contained, as if they were always waiting for an evaluation." "Exactly," nodded Mrs. Jenkins with approval. "It's a shame. The master loves them in his way, but since he lost Emily, it's as if he also lost the ability to show it." That conversation was etched in Catherine's mind as she continued with her day's chores. At dusk, as she cleaned the main hallway with its majestic family portraits, she stopped before a photograph of Emily Morgan. The deceased wife had a luminous smile and kind eyes that seemed to look directly into the soul. Catherine felt a strange shiver upon noticing a certain resemblance in the features, in the shape of the eyes, in the curve of the smile. A coincidence, surely, but disturbing. When she finished her workday, already under the cloak of night, Catherine returned to her small apartment in a modest neighborhood. The contrast between the opulence of the Morgan mansion and the simplicity of her current home was overwhelming. On her work table rested the notebook where each night she wrote fragments of the novel she was trying to reconstruct. The story of a woman who loses everything except her determination and who finds in the most unexpected place a reason to carry on. That night, inspired by the stories she had discovered in the mansion, Catherine wrote until dawn began to filter its grayish light between the curtains. The words flowed like a long-contained river, transporting her away from her current reality, towards the world that existed only in her mind and in the pages she filled with her clear and decisive handwriting. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon, while Alexander was presiding over a meeting with international investors. Diana, his assistant, interrupted the session with a worried expression, something unprecedented in her impeccable professional record. "Mr. Morgan, it's the children's school. Miss Hoffman has suffered an accident. The children are fine, but they need someone to pick them up immediately." Alexander felt that the meticulous control he maintained over all aspects of his life was beginning to crack. His schedule was planned to the minute, and that meeting was crucial for the European expansion he had been preparing for months. "Can't Robert handle it?" he asked, referring to his driver. "He's already gone to get them, sir," explained Diana. "But the headmistress insists on speaking personally with you about an incident that occurred this morning, before Miss Hoffman's accident." 20 minutes later, Alexander was traversing the hallways of the exclusive St. Ignatius School, where academic perfection was cultivated, with the same care with which he directed his businesses. The headmistress, Sophia Mendoza, received him with a formality tinged with concern. "I appreciate you coming personally, Mr. Morgan," she said, indicating a seat in front of her desk. "I would have liked to meet with you under more favorable circumstances." "What has happened exactly?" asked Alexander, direct as always. "I was informed of an accident involving the governess, but now you mention a prior incident." The headmistress interlaced her fingers on the desk, seeking the appropriate words. "This morning, during recess, Matthew was involved in a fight. He was defending his brother, who had been the object of mockery by some classmates." Alexander frowned. Matthew had always been the most reserved, the least problematic. "A fight? My son? The twins have been different lately," continued Sophia. "More withdrawn, with difficulties integrating. The teachers have noticed it for months, but Miss Hoffman always assured that everything was under control." "Months?" The incredulity in Alexander's voice was evident. "And no one considered it appropriate to inform me directly?" "Several detailed reports were sent," responded the headmistress professionally. "They were received and responded to by Miss Hoffman, who acted as your authorized representative in school matters." Alexander felt a pang of guilt. He had completely delegated his children's education, trusting in credentials and references without personally involving himself. The professionalization of parenthood, as he called it in his most honest moments of self-criticism. "As for Miss Hoffman," continued the headmistress, "she apparently slipped on the stairs while leaving hurriedly after a heated exchange with one of the teachers. She has a fracture in her ankle that will require surgery and rehabilitation. She has informed us that she will be on leave for at least 6 weeks." The return to the mansion passed in silence. The twins, seated in the back seat next to Alexander, kept their gaze fixed on their shoes as if anticipating a reprimand that didn't come. Alexander observed them out of the corner of his eye, trying to decipher the thoughts behind those identical and distant expressions. "Why didn't you tell me you were having problems at school?" he finally asked, with a tone that aimed to be understanding but sounded more like an interrogation. Matthew and Daniel exchanged a complicit look, before the former answered, "Miss Hoffman said you were very busy with the international project, that we shouldn't bother you with small things." "Your well-being is never a small thing," responded Alexander, surprising himself with the emotion that permeated his words. "I am your father." "Does that mean Miss Hoffman won't come back?" asked Daniel, with a barely disguised flash of hope. Alexander sighed, recognizing the complexity of the situation he faced. "At least for a few weeks, I'll have to find a temporary replacement." Upon arriving home, the domestic crisis worsened when Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper, informed him that the agency that usually provided qualified personnel couldn't send anyone until the following week. "It's high season for tutors, with final exams approaching," explained Mrs. Jenkins. "All families are seeking educational reinforcements." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, an unusual gesture that betrayed his growing stress. At that moment, Catherine was passing through the vestibule with cleaning supplies. "Excuse me, Mr. Morgan," she intervened timidly. "I wouldn't want to intrude, but if you need supervision for the children, I could help temporarily. I was a teacher for years before coming here." Alexander looked at her skeptically. "A teacher? At what level?" "University mainly," responded Catherine. "Literature and humanities. But I also worked with children in community programs. I have experience with diverse ages and pedagogical methods." "Catherine is right, sir," intervened Mrs. Jenkins. "I've seen her interact with the twins. She has a way with them, and we need an immediate solution." That night, after long calls with the school and the employment agency to verify the available options, Alexander made a decision that went against all his usual protocols. Catherine Sullivan, the housekeeper hired barely a month ago, would temporarily take charge of the education and care of his children. "It will only be until we find someone with the proper credentials," he clarified in a brief meeting in his office. "I expect absolute professionalism and for you to follow the program established by Miss Hoffman." "Of course, Mr. Morgan," nodded Catherine, maintaining a serene expression that hid her inner enthusiasm. "My objective will be to facilitate this transition for the children, respecting the routines they know." What Alexander could not foresee was that this pragmatic decision, made almost grudgingly, would trigger a silent earthquake in the emotional foundations of the Morgan family. A seismic event whose effects would irreversibly transform the internal landscape of that mansion, where time seemed to have stopped 5 years ago. The first week with Catherine as provisional tutor brought subtle but significant changes. Mornings in the Morgan mansion began to awaken with different sounds, animated conversations during breakfast, occasional laughter, even music floating from the study room where the twins now spent their school hours. Alexander, initially skeptical, observed these transformations with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. He had expected problems, delays in the educational program, complaints from the school. Instead, he received positive reports from the teachers, noting improvements in the children's participation and general disposition. One afternoon, upon returning earlier than usual, he found Catherine and the twins in the back garden. They had improvised a small outdoor laboratory where they were studying the ecosystem of an ornamental pond. Daniel was meticulously drawing the aquatic plants, while Matthew classified small insects in transparent containers, both absorbed in the task. "We're documenting the biodiversity of our own garden," explained Catherine upon noticing his presence. "It's a practical way to understand the biology concepts they're studying this term." Alexander nodded, impressed despite himself. The practical approach contrasted with Miss Hoffman's purely theoretical method. "It seems effective," he conceded, observing the enthusiasm with which his children applied themselves to the task. "Have they completed the rest of the daily program?" "Mathematics first thing in the morning when the mind is freshest," responded Catherine with professional confidence. "History after lunch, with a narrative approach that helps them better retain events. And now science in an experimental manner. Tomorrow we'll dedicate the afternoon to literature and written expression." As the days passed, Alexander began to find small excuses to return home earlier. He told himself it was to supervise his children's education, to ensure that Catherine adequately fulfilled her temporary responsibilities. But the truth, which he barely dared to admit, was that he enjoyed seeing the twins like this, alive, curious, awake to the world. One night, during dinner, Daniel posed a question that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "Dad, can we talk about Mom sometime?" Alexander's fork remained suspended halfway between his plate and his mouth. The silence that followed was charged with tension. "Why do you ask that now?" he finally managed to articulate. "Catherine says that remembering the people we love is a way of keeping them with us," explained Daniel, with the disarming simplicity of childhood. "She says that forgetting is the true death." Alexander directed an intense look at Catherine, who dined with them by express invitation of the children, something that had gradually become a custom. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morgan," she intervened softly. "The topic arose when they found a family photograph. I didn't intend to intrude on something so personal." "No, it's all right," responded Alexander after a long moment. "You have the right to know, to remember. Your mother was—" The words got stuck, as if they had been too long without being pronounced. "She was extraordinary. She had a way of looking at the world that made everything seem brighter, more meaningful." That night, for the first time in 5 years, Alexander spoke to his children about Emily. He told them how they had met during a summer in Brighton, how she studied art history and dreamed of restoring ancient paintings, how she laughed with her whole body when something seemed really funny to her. Small fragments of a story interrupted too soon. The twins listened with reverent attention, absorbing each word like parched earth receiving the first drops of rain after a long drought. Catherine remained discreetly in the background, aware of witnessing an intimate moment of family healing. Later, when the children had retired to sleep, Alexander found Catherine in the library, returning the reference books they had used during the day. "Thank you," he said simply, leaning against the doorframe. Catherine turned, surprised by the words she rarely heard from Mr. Morgan's lips. "There's no need to thank me. I only did what seemed right for the children." "Not just for that," clarified Alexander, advancing a few steps into the room. "For reminding me that there are things that shouldn't remain buried. Emily would have agreed with you. She always said that memories are the greatest treasure we possess." A comfortable silence settled between them, illuminated only by the desk lamp that projected a golden circle on the scattered books. "May I ask you something personal?" Alexander finally said. "How did you go from being a university professor to this?" He gestured vaguely, suddenly uncomfortable with the implication of his words. Catherine smiled with no trace of offense. "Life sometimes takes unexpected turns, Mr. Morgan. 2 years ago, an earthquake devastated my region. I lost my home, my position at the university, my manuscripts, everything. I came to this country seeking stability while rebuilding my professional life. Cleaning wasn't my vocation, but honest work never dishonors." The sincerity of her response moved Alexander more than he would have expected. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the second time that night those words seemed insufficient but necessary. "I didn't know." "You had no reason to know," responded Catherine with quiet dignity. "We are what we do in the present, not the titles or positions we had in the past. Right now I am a tutor to 2 extraordinary children, and that fills me with pride." That conversation marked a before and after in the relationship between Catherine and Alexander. Professional respect began to mix with something more difficult to define, a nascent complicity, a mutual recognition of qualities that went beyond their established roles. Meanwhile, at the company, the problems with the international project worsened. Frank Harrison seemed increasingly evasive in his reports, delegating responsibilities he normally assumed with enthusiasm. Alexander began to notice discrepancies in the figures, inexplicable delays, contradictory communications with foreign partners. One morning, Diana entered his office with a grave expression. "Mr. Morgan, Jack Torres from the Mexico office just called. He says they received contradictory instructions about the Monterrey project. Apparently, someone who identified themselves as an authorized representative ordered substantial changes to the plans without your approval." Alexander felt an internal alarm, an instinct developed over years in the business world where misplaced trust could cost millions. Did Torres mention who gave those instructions? Not directly, but he insinuated that they came from Mr. Harrison's office. The way back home that afternoon was marked by a tension different from the usual. Professional concerns, which normally occupied all his mental space, now competed with thoughts about the family situation, about the positive changes he was witnessing, about Catherine's increasingly significant presence in their lives. Upon entering the mansion, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks: piano music. For 5 years, the magnificent grand piano that occupied a privileged place in the main room had remained closed, silent, like an elegant tomb. Emily had been a passionate amateur pianist, and after her death, Alexander hadn't been able to bear the idea of anyone else playing that instrument, that for him symbolized the very soul of his wife. He followed the sound with silent steps until he peered into the room. Catherine was seated at the piano, with Matthew and Daniel on either side. Her fingers glided over the keys, interpreting a simple but beautiful melody. The twins watched with fascination the movement of her hands, following the sheet music placed on the stand. Alexander wanted to feel indignation at that intrusion into a space he considered sacred, but what he experienced was a completely different emotion: gratitude. The piano was sounding again. Music was returning to that house where silence had reigned too long. It was as if a long-closed window suddenly opened, allowing fresh air and light to pour in abundantly. He remained there, invisible to the three, absorbing the moment. When the piece ended, the twins applauded with childish enthusiasm. "Can we learn to play, Catherine?" asked Matthew with an emotion he rarely showed. "I want to play like you. If your father permits it, it would be an honor to teach you," she responded. Music is not only beautiful, it also develops concentration and coordination, and it's a universal language that connects us with the deepest part of ourselves. "Mom loved the piano," commented Daniel with a dreamy voice. "Dad told me last night." Alexander discreetly withdrew before being discovered, carrying with him the image of that moment and the sound of music that seemed to pursue him like an echo from the past and perhaps a presage of the future. The weeks turned into months, and the temporary solution of Catherine as tutor was prolonged when Miss Hoffman communicated her decision not to return. The German governess had accepted a position in Switzerland, more prestigious and better paid, justifying her resignation with a formal letter that barely mentioned the children she had educated for 3 years. "Would you prefer that we look for another governess?" Alexander asked the twins during breakfast, carefully observing their reactions. Matthew and Daniel exchanged one of those complicit looks that only identical twins can share. "We like Catherine," Matthew finally responded, acting as a tacit spokesperson. "We learn more with her. She's fun, but also demanding." Alexander nodded, secretly relieved. He himself had noticed the children's academic progress, corroborated by school reports that showed significant improvements not only in grades, but also in participation and social skills. "Then I'll speak with her to formalize her new position," he decided, surprised by how natural that decision felt, so contrary to his usual meticulous personnel selection processes. The conversation with Catherine took place in the office, that space that Alexander considered his personal sanctuary. She entered with the same quiet dignity that characterized her, without the servile attitude that many adopted in the powerful businessman's presence. "The children are flourishing under your guidance," Alexander began, opting for a less formal tone. "I would like to officially offer you the position of permanent governess, of course with the salary and conditions corresponding to that position." Catherine remained silent for a few moments, as if weighing something beyond the job offer. "I appreciate the trust, Mr. Morgan," she finally responded. "I accept with one condition, that you allow me to implement some modifications to the educational program. I believe Matthew and Daniel would benefit from a more creative and integrated approach." "What do you have in mind?" asked Alexander, genuinely interested. "Include more artistic activities, like the piano classes they've begun to enjoy. Also, educational excursions, practical projects, even some community service adapted to their age. A balanced education that develops both their intellect and their sensitivity." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the woman before him. In any other circumstance, he would have considered that proposal an unacceptable intrusion, but the results spoke for themselves. His children were changing, opening like flowers long deprived of light. "Agreed," he conceded. "I trust your professional judgment. I only ask for regular reports, and that you maintain the academic standards the school requires." Catherine's smile illuminated the office like a ray of sunshine slipping through heavy curtains. "I won't disappoint you or the children," she promised with a conviction that made it impossible to doubt her words. That same day, another much less pleasant conversation was taking place at the central offices of Morgan Developments. Frank Harrison had requested a private meeting that Alexander could no longer postpone after weeks of avoiding direct confrontations while gathering information on the irregularities in the international project. "We need to talk about the direction the company is taking," Frank began without preambles. "Some board members are concerned about recent decisions." "Which decisions specifically?" responded Alexander, maintaining a neutral tone that hid his growing suspicion. "Your lack of personal involvement in the Monterey project to start. You delegate too much, arrive late to crucial meetings, seem distracted." "Interesting observation, coming from someone who has been sending unauthorized instructions to our team in Mexico," Alexander countered, dropping the accusation like someone placing a winning card on the table. Frank momentarily paled before regaining his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. Everything I've done has been trying to save a project that seems to have stopped interesting you. The Alexander Morgan I've known for 20 years would never have allowed these delays, these indecisions. The Alexander Morgan you know would never have tolerated the manipulation of information or unilateral decision-making in a joint project," he responded, hardening his tone. "I have proof, Frank. Emails, testimonies, suspicious transfers. The question is why?" The exchange continued for almost 2 hours, oscillating between veiled accusations and increasingly weak justifications. In the end, Frank hinted at what really bothered him. "You've changed since that woman entered your house. Do you think I don't notice that people don't talk? A simple housekeeper turned governess to your children, practically running your home while you look at her, as if she were a divine apparition." Alexander stood up, barely containing the anger he felt at that intrusion into his personal life. "My family decisions are exactly that. Mine. And I suggest you concentrate on explaining the financial discrepancies in the Monterey project before worrying about who educates my children." He returned home that night with a troubled mind, divided between the professional betrayal he had just confirmed and the insinuations about Catherine that, although he rejected them as malicious, had touched a sensitive fiber in his interior. Had he really changed in recent months? Was it so evident to those around him? Upon entering the mansion, He heard laughter coming from the kitchen. Following the sound, he found an unusual scene. Catherine, the twins, and Mrs. Jenkins around the central island, preparing what appeared to be traditional pastries. All had flour on their hands and smiles on their faces. "Dad, we're making alfajores like the ones from Catherine's village," exclaimed Daniel upon seeing him. "You have to try them. The recipe has been passed down from generation to generation in my family," explained Catherine, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's a tradition to prepare them in my country to celebrate important achievements." "And what are we celebrating?" asked Alexander, contagiously affected by the festive atmosphere despite himself. "The twins obtained the best grades in their science projects," responded Catherine with pride. "They worked very hard and deserve a special reward." Alexander looked at his children, noting the gleam of satisfaction in their eyes. He couldn't remember the last time they had celebrated an achievement, big or small. Efficiency had substituted for joy, evaluations for celebrations. "In that case, I think I should help," he said, removing his coat and rolling up his shirt sleeves before the astonished gaze of Mrs. Jenkins, who had never seen Mr. Morgan participate in domestic tasks. That night, as they savored the alfajores in the kitchen's informal dining area, Alexander experienced a sensation he had forgotten: belonging. He wasn't the CEO, or the implacable businessman, or even the distant father who established rules from afar. He was simply part of something warm and authentic, a shared moment without agendas or expectations. "Tomorrow is Catherine's birthday," Daniel suddenly announced. "We thought we could do something special for her, like she always does for us." Alexander looked at Catherine, surprised by the information and by not having known it before. "It wasn't necessary to mention it," she said with a certain timidity. "I don't usually celebrate those dates much, especially away from my homeland." "Every person deserves to be celebrated on their day," responded Alexander, making a spontaneous decision. "What do you say if tomorrow we all go out to dinner together? I know a restaurant that serves dishes from your country. It could be a small token of gratitude for everything you've done for this family." The proposal was received with enthusiasm by the twins and with a grateful smile from Catherine. For Alexander, it represented more than a simple gesture of courtesy. It was a tacit recognition that Catherine had become something more than an employee. She was an essential part of the fragile equilibrium that was rebuilding his family. That night, in the solitude of his room, Alexander allowed himself to reflect on Frank's accusatory words. He had changed, it was true, but the change didn't feel like a weakness or a distraction, as his partner insinuated. It felt like an awakening, as if he had been sleepwalking for 5 years and was finally beginning to open his eyes. What he couldn't or didn't want to admit yet, even to himself, was the true nature of the feelings that Catherine was beginning to awaken in him, feelings that went beyond gratitude or professional admiration, and that filled him with both hope and guilt. The birthday dinner was a turning point. The restaurant, a small family establishment with authentic decoration from Catherine's country, offered them an intimate atmosphere where the usual formalities between employer and employee naturally blurred. Catherine shone in a simple blue dress that contrasted with the uniform they were used to seeing her in. Alexander, accustomed to her image in work clothes, was surprised to find himself admiring the natural elegance of her movements, the warmth of her smile, as she explained to the twins the origin of each traditional dish they tasted. "My grandmother prepared this dessert on special occasions," commented Catherine, as they shared a homemade flan with dulce de leche. "She said that food has memory, that each flavor connects us with those who came before us." "Like music," observed Daniel thoughtfully. "You said that each song we play on the piano is like talking with those who composed it many years ago." Catherine smiled, evidently pleased by the connection the child had established. "Exactly. Art, food, stories. They're invisible bridges between generations, between cultures. They remind us that we're not alone in the world." Alexander observed the exchange with fascination, recognizing the way Catherine turned each moment into a learning opportunity without it seeming like a formal lesson. It was a natural gift, an ability to awaken curiosity and deep thinking even in everyday situations. "How did you celebrate your birthdays in your country?" he asked, genuinely interested in knowing more about her. Catherine's face lit up with memories. "My family would gather in the courtyard of my house. My father played the guitar, My mother prepared a feast that took us days to complete. The neighbors came without formal invitation. It was a celebration of community as much as a personal one. She paused, with eyes bright with nostalgia. What I miss most are those connections, that sense of belonging. Now you belong with us, said Matthew, with the direct honesty of children, provoking a moment of emotion at the table. When they returned to the mansion, the twins, exhausted but happy, said goodbye with spontaneous hugs before going up to their rooms. Alexander and Catherine were left alone in the vestibule, in one of those silences charged with unexpressed possibilities. "Thank you for tonight," she finally said. "It's been the best birthday I've had in a long time." "I'm the one who should thank you," responded Alexander, surprised by the sincerity that flowed without effort. "Not just for today, but for everything you've brought to this house. Light, music, laughter, plus life. We had been functioning like automatons for too long, existing without really living." Catherine looked at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting an emotion that went beyond professional gratitude. "The twins are extraordinary children who just needed space to flourish. And you," she hesitated for an instant, "you are much more than you allow yourself to be, Mr. Morgan." "Alexander," he corrected softly. "I think after all this time, and especially after tonight, we can leave the formalities." "Alexander," she repeated, and the simple sound of his name on her lips seemed to change something in the atmosphere between them. They said goodbye with a new mutual awareness, a connection that had been silently building for months, and that now seemed impossible to ignore. The next day, routine was re-established, but with subtle differences. Conversations were more fluid, smiles more frequent, shared spaces more comfortable. The mansion, which for years had functioned with the cold efficiency of a well-oiled machine, was beginning to feel like a true home. Meanwhile, at the company, the situation with Frank Harrison was deteriorating. An internal audit, discreetly ordered by Alexander, had revealed serious irregularities in the management of the Monterey project. Diverted funds, manipulated contracts, phantom partners receiving unjustified payments. The pattern was clear, but devastating. The person he had professionally trusted for 2 decades had been systematically betraying him. "We'll have to file a formal complaint," his lawyer Richard Bennett warned him, as they reviewed the findings in the privacy of Alexander's office. "This goes beyond business disagreements. We're talking about outright fraud." "What are the options?" asked Alexander, feeling the weight of a decision that would not only affect his personal relationship with Frank, but the stability of the entire company. "We can try an internal resolution, forcing him to return the funds and resign quietly. Or we can proceed legally, which would imply negative publicity, but would establish a clear precedent." Alexander massaged his temples, feeling the onset of a migraine. "Give me a few days to decide. I want to review all the implications." That afternoon, while driving back home, he received an unexpected call. It was Eleanor, his younger sister, who had been living abroad for the past 6 years. "Surprise, big brother." The familiar voice vibrated through the car speaker. "I'm at the airport. Do you think you could host your favorite sister for a few weeks?" Alexander felt a mixture of joy and apprehension. Eleanor and he had always had a complicated relationship, marked by genuine love, but also by fundamental disagreements about life, business, and especially about how he had handled the situation after Emily's death. "Of course, Eleanor. Robert can pick you up if you give me your flight details." "I'm already in a taxi. See you in about an hour." "I'm dying to see the twins. Are they still those perfectly programmed little robots?" Alexander smiled despite himself. Eleanor had always been brutally honest, a quality he both admired and feared in equal measure. "You'll be in for some surprises," he responded simply. When he arrived home, Catherine had already been informed of the imminent visit and was helping Mrs. Jenkins prepare the guest room. "Your sister arrives today, from what I've been told," she commented as they crossed in the hallway. "The twins are very excited. They speak wonders of their crazy aunt who lives adventures around the world." Alexander smiled, recognizing the perfect description of Eleanor. "She's a force of nature," he admitted. "Brilliant, impulsive, brutally sincere. She studied economics like me, but decided to apply it in the humanitarian field instead of in business. She works for international organizations in crisis zones." "It sounds fascinating," responded Catherine with genuine interest. The twins needed that different influence, someone to show them another approach to life. Eleanor's arrival was exactly as expected, noisy, colourful, disruptive. She entered like a whirlwind of energy, with exotic gifts for the twins, incredible stories from her travels, and an evaluating gaze that missed no detail of the changes in the mansion. "My little scientists," she exclaimed upon seeing Matthew and Daniel, embracing them effusively. "You've grown so much, and you seem different, more alive, more like children, and less like mini-executives." During dinner, Eleanor kept everyone entertained with anecdotes of her experiences in Africa and Asia, where she had worked on microfinance projects for entrepreneurial women. The twins drank in every word, fascinated by that world so different from theirs. It was inevitable that Eleanor would notice the dynamic between Catherine, Alexander, and the children. Her perceptive gaze moved from one to another during the conversation, catching the complicit smiles, the warmth of the interactions, the evident transformation in the family atmosphere she remembered. Later, when the twins retired to sleep, and Catherine excused herself to finish some preparations for the next day's classes, Eleanor was left alone with her brother in the study. "So, Catherine," she said directly, pouring herself a glass of the wine they had opened during dinner. "Interesting evolution from housekeeper to what exactly? Because what I've seen tonight goes beyond a professional relationship." Alexander tensed, uncomfortable with the observation, though not surprised by his sister's perspicacity. "She's an extraordinary woman who has had a very positive impact on the children," he responded cautiously. "I hired her as a housekeeper, but when I discovered her academic background and experience as a teacher, I offered her the position of governess. She's been a blessing for this family." Murmured Eleanor, clearly not satisfied with the explanation. "And the fact that you look at her the way you used to look at Emily has nothing to do with it, I suppose." The comment impacted Alexander like a physical blow. "That's completely inappropriate, Eleanor." "The comment or your feelings," she replied, implacable but without malice, "because if it's the latter, I disagree. It's been 5 years, Alexander, 5 years in which you've been functioning on autopilot, existing but not living. If this woman has managed to awaken something in you, something that makes you remember you're human, that you have a heart beneath that facade of corporate perfection, I consider it a miracle worthy of celebration." Alexander kept silent, disconcerted by the precision with which his sister had articulated feelings he barely dared to recognize. "It's complicated," he finally admitted. "Life is complicated," responded Eleanor with an understanding smile. "Love is complicated. But the alternative is that emotional limbo you've been living in, and frankly, I prefer to see you vulnerable and confused than perfectly composed and dead inside." The conversation continued until the late hours of the night, shifting to professional topics when Alexander shared the situation with Frank and the decisions he had to make. "I always distrusted him," confessed Eleanor, who in the past had briefly worked for the company before following her own path. "Too charming, too willing to agree with everything you said, except when he could subtly sabotage you. Why did you never say anything?" "I did, little brother, but you were so sure of your judgment, so convinced that only you could see clearly in the business world." Eleanor left the sentence unfinished, but the message was clear. Alexander vaguely remembered his sister's warnings, dismissed then as the fruit of inexperience or personal rivalries. A similar pattern to how he had dismissed his children's emotional needs, convinced that his rational approach was superior. "I've made many mistakes, haven't I?" he said, with the honesty he could only allow himself with her. "We all make them," responded Eleanor, surprisingly gentle. "The difference lies in our ability to recognize them and change, and you, dear brother, finally seem to be on that path." Eleanor's visit, initially planned for a few weeks, extended to a month. Her presence added a new dimension to the family dynamic. Weekends were filled with improvised excursions, games in the garden, international cooking sessions where each one contributed knowledge and experiences. Catherine and Eleanor developed a natural complicity, united by their love of literature, social causes, and though neither mentioned it openly, by their concern for the twins and for Alexander. One Sunday afternoon, while Eleanor helped the children build an urban garden in a corner of the vast garden, Alexander and Catherine found themselves alone on the terrace, observing the scene from a distance. "Your sister is extraordinary," commented Catherine. "She has connected with the children in a very special way. She always was like that, capable of entering any situation and transforming it with her energy, responded Alexander. Sometimes I think she should have been the one in charge of the twins when Emily died. She would have done a much better job than me. Catherine looked at him with a mixture of understanding and firmness. Each person contributes what they can at the moment they can do it. You gave them stability, material security, a structure in a moment of emotional chaos. Perhaps it wasn't the only thing they needed, but it was valuable. And now you're learning, evolving as a father. That's what truly matters. Alexander felt a wave of gratitude for this woman who always seemed to find the right words, who saw the best in him even when he himself couldn't do it. "Thank you for believing in me," he said simply, allowing his eyes to transmit what he still didn't dare to express in words. Catherine held his gaze a moment before responding. It's easy to believe in someone when you see their true heart. The moment hung suspended between them, loaded with implicit meanings and possibilities barely outlined. An invisible bridge that was beginning to materialize, uniting two shores that had remained separated by circumstances, conventions, and fears that little by little were losing their power. The revelation came on an ordinary Tuesday, during an afternoon of torrential rain that kept everyone secluded in the mansion. Catherine had organized a day of creative projects for the twins, who were absorbed in the library building a diorama about tropical ecosystems. Eleanor had gone out early to a meeting with former colleagues, and Alexander was working in his office, preparing the legal strategy against Frank Harrison after the board of directors had unanimously backed his decision to proceed with formal actions. The sound of broken glass and a stifled cry abruptly pulled him from his documents. He ran towards the source of the noise and found Catherine on the floor of the annexed library, surrounded by fragments of glass and old photographs. An overturned ladder next to her indicated the cause of the accident. "Catherine," he exclaimed, kneeling beside her, "are you hurt?" She rose slowly, dazed but apparently unharmed. "I'm fine. It was just the shock," she assured, though Alexander noticed a small cut on her hand. "I'm so sorry. I was looking for reference material for the children's project, and the box slipped." Alexander looked at the scattered photographs, old images of Emily's family, of her native village, of traditional celebrations that his wife had always treasured. "Don't worry about that," he said, helping her to her feet. "Let me see that hand." As he cleaned and bandaged the small wound in the first aid kit, Alexander noticed something strange in Catherine's expression. It wasn't just physical pain or embarrassment about the accident. It was a kind of disturbed recognition, as if she had seen something that had deeply affected her. "Are you sure you're all right? You seem unsettled." Catherine hesitated a moment before responding. "It's just that some of those photographs seemed familiar to me. The village, the celebrations." She paused, visibly nervous. "I think Emily and I were from the same place. I recognized the square, the church, even some people in the group photos." Alexander looked at her fixedly, slowly processing the information. "Are you saying you knew my wife?" "Not personally," Catherine quickly clarified. "We were from the same community, but she must have left before I was old enough to remember her. But I recognize her family, especially an older woman who must be her grandmother. She organized the traditional festivals that appear in those photos." The coincidence was too extraordinary to be casual. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. "Why did you never mention this before? You knew my wife had passed away. You knew her name." "I never knew her maiden name," explained Catherine, increasingly uncomfortable. "I only knew her as Emily Morgan, the woman from the city who had succeeded and married a businessman. Her story was told in the village as an example of overcoming. And when I arrived here, I didn't make the connection immediately." Alexander tried to stay calm, though his mind accelerated with implications, doubts, and a strange sensation of destiny intervening in their lives. "Show me which photographs you recognized," he asked, returning with her to the library. During the next hour, Catherine identified people, places, and events in the old images. Her knowledge was too specific, too authentic to be fabricated. She mentioned details that only someone truly familiar with that small community could know: the peculiar taste of the bread made by the local baker, the temperament of the old parish priest, the superstitions associated with certain corners of the village. "This child here," she said, pointing to a small girl in the background of a group photograph. "I think it's me. I would have been about 5 years old at this celebration." Alexander examined the image carefully. It was impossible to confirm the identity with certainty, but the temporal and geographical coincidence was amazing. The idea that Catherine and Emily had shared an origin, that their paths had crossed without knowing it, and that now, by a twist of fate, Catherine was caring for Emily's children, seemed too perfect to be a simple coincidence. "The twins should know this," he finally said. "It's a connection to their roots, to their mother's land." Catherine nodded, though Alexander perceived her apprehension. "Of course. I just hope you don't think I intentionally hid this information. It was genuinely a surprise to me." Before they could continue the conversation, the ring of the telephone interrupted the moment. It was Diana, his assistant, with urgent news. "Mr. Morgan, there's been a leak," she informed with a tense voice. "Frank Harrison has called a press conference for this afternoon. According to our sources, he plans to publicly accuse you of emotional instability and erratic business decisions. He's linking everything to your personal situation and to the presence of a certain employee in your home." Alexander's world seemed to momentarily stop. The professional betrayal was turning into a personal attack that threatened not only his reputation, but the stability of the environment he had created for his children. And worse yet, it dragged Catherine into a public scandal she didn't deserve. "Prepare the legal team," he instructed Diana with a controlled voice, "and contact our allies in the media. We won't respond directly to the accusations, but we need to be prepared to control the damage." Upon hanging up, he found Catherine observing him with concern. "Problems at the company?" she asked softly. Alexander hesitated. He could protect her by hiding the gravity of the situation, but something in him had changed. He no longer believed in walls as a solution, not even when they were meant to protect. "My partner, Frank Harrison, has been embezzling funds, and now that he's been discovered, he plans to counterattack publicly," he explained. "He'll try to discredit me by questioning my mental stability and using you as part of his strategy." Catherine visibly paled. "Me? How could I be relevant to a business conflict? He'll insinuate that my judgment is clouded because—" Alexander sought the appropriate words. "Because I have an inappropriate relationship with my children's governess, previously hired as a housekeeper." The silence that followed was charged with unexpressed emotions, indignation at the injustice, concern about the imminent scandal, but also the tacit recognition that Frank's insinuations, though malicious in their intention, touched on a truth that both had been avoiding naming. "I should resign," Catherine finally said, with a firm but hurt voice. "I can't be the cause of a scandal that affects your reputation, or worse yet, the children's well-being." "Absolutely not," responded Alexander, with a vehemence that surprised them both. "I will not allow Frank or anyone to dictate who can be part of my children's lives, or mine." Before Catherine could respond, they heard excited shouts from the garden. Eleanor had returned and, despite the rain, was playing with the twins in the puddles, all soaked and laughing, as if there were no tomorrow. "Dad! Catherine!" called Matthew, upon seeing them look out the window. "Come with us. It's super fun." Alexander and Catherine exchanged a look, conscious of the media storm that was approaching, but also of the simple joy unfolding before their eyes. "Go with them," said Alexander. "I'll handle the crisis. Don't let this ruin what you've built with the children." "What we've built," Catherine corrected softly. "All together." That night, after the twins fell asleep exhausted from the races in the rain, the three adults met in Alexander's office to discuss the situation. Eleanor, always pragmatic, took control of the conversation. "We need to get ahead of Frank," she declared, pacing around the room with contained energy. "His strategy is clearly to turn a case of corporate fraud into a personal scandal to divert attention. The media will choose the juicier story, regardless of the facts," commented Alexander bitterly. "Not necessarily," intervened Catherine. "Not if we offer them a more powerful narrative." Alexander and Eleanor looked at her with curiosity. "For years I was a literature professor," explained Catherine. "If there's one thing I learned, it's that stories have power and that truth told with authenticity always resonates more deeply than manipulation." "What do you propose exactly?" asked Eleanor, intrigued. "Strategic transparency," responded Catherine. "Instead of hiding or denying, let's take control of the narrative. Your brother is a respected businessman who, after losing his wife, prioritized his children's material stability. Now he's rediscovering the importance of balance between work and family. and has hired a professional educator for his children. Meanwhile, he discovers that a trusted partner has been taking advantage of his dedication to family matters to commit fraud. "It's the truth," observed Eleanor with admiration, "simply presented in a way that anyone can empathize with. And the coincidence with Emily's village adds an almost providential element to the story," added Alexander, beginning to see the potential of that approach. During the following hours, the three developed a media strategy based on controlled transparency. Eleanor, with her contacts in the international sphere, could provide a respected external perspective. Catherine, with her academic training and genuine connection with the children, represented a pillar of stability, not a distraction. And Alexander, by openly recognizing his personal evolution without detailing intimate aspects, could transform what Frank intended to present as weakness into a demonstration of authentic strength. "There's something else you should know," said Catherine when they were finalizing the details. "I've been working on a book during my free hours, a novel partially inspired by my experiences here." Alexander looked at her, surprised, with a mixture of curiosity and slight alarm. "A novel? About us?" "Not exactly," Catherine clarified. "It's fictional, of course, but yes, some dynamics, some reflections are inspired by what I've observed and experienced in this house. I never intended to publish it without your knowledge, but given that we're talking about transparency, I'd like to read it," said Alexander after a moment of reflection. "If that's all right with you." "Me too," added Eleanor enthusiastically. "I've always believed that the best stories are those that have one foot in reality, even when presented as fiction." Catherine promised to share the manuscript the next day, visibly relieved by the positive reaction to her confession. When Eleanor finally retired to rest, Alexander and Catherine were left alone in the office. The rain had ceased, but its trace persisted in the scent of wet earth that entered through the partially open windows. "I'm sorry for involving you in all this," said Alexander, breaking the silence. "It's not fair that your reputation should be compromised by a corporate conflict that has nothing to do with you." Catherine looked at him directly, with that mixture of sweetness and determination that characterized her. "Life is rarely fair, Alexander. What's important isn't the storms we face, but who is at our side while it rains." Her words, simple but profound, resonated in Alexander's heart with a clarity that dispelled the last doubts. In that moment, without need for grandiose declarations, both recognized that what had grown between them was too valuable, too authentic to be sacrificed on the altar of appearances or social conveniences. "Whatever happens tomorrow," said Alexander, gently taking her bandaged hand, "I want you to know that I don't regret having opened the doors of this house to you, or of my life." Catherine interlaced her fingers with his in a gesture that sealed a silent pact. They would face together the approaching storm, protecting above all the fragile happiness they had begun to build. The first page of Catherine's manuscript trembled slightly in Alexander's hands as he began to read. Seated in the privacy of his office, with the first lights of dawn filtering through the windows, he immersed himself in those words that promised to reveal a new perspective of his own life. The title, "Echoes of Silence," was already suggestive. The story began with a scene that was painfully familiar to him, a man contemplating a house empty of emotions, though full of material luxuries, wondering at what moment he had confused success with happiness. As he advanced in the reading, Alexander recognized transformed but recognizable elements: the withdrawn children who flourished under a new influence, the music that returned to long silent spaces, the recovered traditions as bridges between past and present. But what impacted him most was the way Catherine had captured his internal struggle, that conflict between control as a defense mechanism and the human need for connection and vulnerability. The character inspired by him was neither idealized nor demonized. He was deeply human, imperfect, sometimes obstinate, painfully aware of his failures, but also capable of evolution and redemption. Catherine had seen in him what few bothered to look for beneath the facade of the implacable businessman, the wounded man who was trying to protect what he loved most in the only way he knew. When he finished reading, hours later, Alexander remained motionless, processing the experience. The novel wasn't complete. It ended at a point where the characters faced a crisis that threatened their fragile, newly found equilibrium. The ending remained open, as if Catherine herself wasn't sure how to conclude a story that continued developing in real time. The sound of the door opening softly interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor entered, holding her own copy of the manuscript. "I just finished," she said, sitting across from him. "It's extraordinary, isn't it?" Alexander nodded, still too moved to articulate his feelings clearly. "It's like looking in a mirror that reflects not only what you are, but what you could be," he finally responded. "Catherine has seen things in me that I didn't even recognize myself." "That's the difference between looking and truly seeing," commented Eleanor. "Most people only look at the surface, the successful businessman, the widower who raised his children alone. Catherine sees beyond that. She sees the complete man with his contradictions and potential." "Do you think she should publish it?" asked Alexander, genuinely interested in his sister's opinion. Eleanor considered the question seriously before responding. "I think it's a work with real literary merit, beyond our personal connection with the story. And I think it could resonate with many people who have experienced similar losses or who struggle with the same dilemma between control and vulnerability." She made a significant pause. "But the final decision must be yours and the children's. After all, though fictionalized, it is also your story." Alexander thanked his sister for her honesty. Before they could continue the conversation, Diana called to inform him that Frank Harrison's press conference had been moved up to noon. They had no time to lose. Events developed rapidly from that moment. While Alexander prepared for the media confrontation, Catherine decided to spend the morning with the twins, keeping them occupied with a special project, the creation of a family album that incorporated both old and new photographs, intertwining the past with the present. "Is this the town square from Mum's village?" asked Daniel, examining with curiosity one of the photographs that had survived the previous day's accident. "Yes," confirmed Catherine. "And look at this other one. It's the summer solstice celebration. I was there that day, although I was very small." The twins looked at her with amazement as if they had just discovered their tutor possessed magical powers. "Did you know Mum?" asked Matthew with wide eyes. "Not personally," explained Catherine. "She was older than me and left the village when I was a very young child, but I knew her family, participated in the same traditions. In a way we share roots, like trees that grew in the same soil." While working on the album, Catherine taught them traditional songs from the region, told them legends that were passed down from generation to generation, showed them how to prepare a typical dessert that Emily's grandmother used to make for special celebrations. "It's as if Mum was sending us pieces of herself through you," observed Daniel, with that intuition that sometimes seemed disconcerting in a child his age. Catherine felt her eyes fill with tears at the depth of that comment. "Perhaps that's exactly how life works," she responded, embracing him. "The people we love never truly leave. They remain in the stories we tell, in the traditions we maintain, in the small gestures we learned from them." Meanwhile, in the city center, the confrontation everyone feared was developing with an unexpected turn. Frank Harrison, confident in the power of his position and the effectiveness of his defamatory strategy, found himself surprised when, minutes before his press conference, the main media received a detailed report of the internal audit that revealed his fraudulent activities, accompanied by testimonies from international partners who corroborated the accusations. Alexander's preventive move, orchestrated with the help of Eleanor and her network of contacts, had completely changed the tone of the public conversation. When Frank tried to divert attention to Alexander's personal life, the journalists, already informed about the manipulation attempts, persistently returned to the central topic: corporate fraud and professional betrayal. The image that emerged from that media day was radically different from what Frank had planned. Instead of a businessman destabilized by questionable personal influences, Alexander Morgan appeared as an upright leader who had detected illicit activities in his own company and had acted responsibly, while simultaneously reassessing his life priorities after years of exclusive dedication to work. When Alexander returned home that afternoon, he found Catherine and the twins in the back garden, planting a small tree. "It's an olive tree," explained Matthew enthusiastically. "Catherine says that in her village, which was also Mom's, they plant an olive tree to celebrate new beginnings. They live for hundreds of years," added Daniel, "so they'll be here long after us, like a living memory." Alexander joined them in the task, feeling the deep symbolism of that simple act. As his hands worked the earth alongside those of his children and Catherine's, he briefly shared the outcome of the crisis with Frank, adapting the information to be comprehensible for the children without frightening them. "Does that mean there's no more danger?" asked Matthew, always practical and direct. "It means that truth has prevailed," responded Alexander, "and that we've learned something important. When we remain united and honest, we can face any storm." That night, after the twins were asleep, Alexander found Catherine in the library, organizing the materials they had used for the family album. Her novel manuscript rested on the table, next to the old photographs of the village. "I read it," said Alexander, pointing to the manuscript. "It's beautiful, Catherine, and true in the deepest sense of the word." She smiled at him, with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "I'm glad you saw it that way. I feared you might feel it as an invasion of your privacy." "On the contrary," he responded, coming closer. "It has helped me see myself with greater clarity. Sometimes we need the mirror of fiction to recognize our most essential truths." A complicit silence ensued, one of those moments suspended in time where words seem unnecessary. Finally, Alexander spoke. "You should finish it and publish it, with the necessary changes to protect privacy, of course, but without losing the essence of what makes this story special." Catherine looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure? Once it's out there—" "I know it's in good hands," he interrupted softly. "I trust you, Catherine. With my children, with our story, with—" He made a significant pause. "With my heart." The confession, subtle but unequivocal, floated between them like a promise not yet fully pronounced, but already irrevocable. Catherine extended her hand, finding Alexander's halfway, their fingers interlaced, silently sealing a pact of trust and possibilities. "The ending is still to be written," she said quietly. "In the novel and in life. I hope we can write it together," he responded, slowly leaning towards her, eliminating the distance they had maintained for so long out of convention, out of prudence, out of fear. Their first kiss was like the end of a long winter, soft, warm, promising new beginnings, new. A perfect moment that nevertheless was interrupted by a voice from the door. "Excuse the interruption, but I think you need to see this." Eleanor was there, holding a tablet with a serious expression. On the screen, a headline stood out in bold letters. "Anonymous financial analysis reveals the true magnitude of fraud at Morgan Developments." The article detailed technical aspects that not even the internal audit had been able to discover, revealing a pattern of accounting manipulation that dated back years. "This doesn't come from our legal or financial team," explained Eleanor, confused. "Someone with a deep knowledge of economics and data analysis has sent this report to the media, completely reinforcing your position." Alexander and Catherine exchanged a look of surprise, but it was Eleanor who connected the dots first. "Catherine, you mentioned you were a university professor. In what field specifically?" "Literature mainly, but—" Catherine hesitated for an instant. "My first degree was in economics. I worked as a financial analyst before dedicating myself to the humanities." The revelation floated in the air like a final piece fitting into a complex puzzle. Alexander looked at Catherine with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "It was you," he said, not as a question but as a confirmation. "You used your knowledge to help me without saying anything." Catherine nodded slightly with a timid smile. "I reviewed the reports you left in your office a few weeks ago. The patterns were evident to someone with training in forensic financial analysis. I didn't want to intrude, but when the situation became critical—" "You saved my company," completed Alexander, marveling at this new facet of the woman he thought he knew. "Just like you saved my children. Just like you're saving me." "We save each other," corrected Catherine softly. "That's how true love works." The word floated between them, finally pronounced after months of circumlocutions and contained emotions. Eleanor, smiling at the scene, discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone to explore the new chapter that was beginning to be written in their lives, no longer on paper and ink, but in the more enduring language of hearts that finally find their home. The news arrived in the form of a certified letter with a foreign stamp, 3 weeks after the media confrontation with Frank Harrison. The envelope, addressed to Catherine Sullivan, contained official documents in a language that only she could read fluently. Alexander observed how her face changed as she advanced in the reading. Surprise, disbelief, emotion, and finally a kind of silent shock. "What's happening?" he asked, concerned by her sudden pallor. Catherine raised her gaze from the papers, her eyes bright with contained tears. "It's from the university where I worked before the earthquake," she explained with a trembling voice. "They found part of my manuscripts and personal documents during the reconstruction of the Central Library," and she paused to control her emotion. "They're offering me a position as a visiting professor for the next semester, with the possibility of recovering my permanent chair afterward." The news hit Alexander like an unexpected punch. Part of him was sincerely happy for Catherine, aware of what it meant for her to recover fragments of her previous life, to receive professional recognition that she deserved. But another part, selfish and fearful, could only think about the possibility of losing her, just when their relationship was beginning to consolidate. "That's wonderful," he managed to say, struggling to sound genuinely happy. "You must be excited." Catherine looked at him fixedly, reading the contradictory emotions on his face. "It's complicated," she admitted. "On one hand, it represents everything I worked for years. On the other, my life is here now. With the children, with you." The tension of the moment was interrupted by the noisy arrival of the twins, returning from school with Eleanor. They had developed a special relationship with their aunt during the last few weeks, taking advantage of her presence to absorb her travel stories and her unique perspective of the world. "Catherine," exclaimed Daniel, running towards her, "Miss Martinez says my composition about the traditions of your village is the best in the class. She wants me to present it at the end-of-course cultural festival." Matthew, less effusive but equally enthusiastic, added, "And I played the melody you taught me in music class. The teacher asked where I had learned it." Catherine embraced both, momentarily keeping the letter in the pocket of her skirt. The children didn't need to face the uncertainty that offer generated until the adults had had time to process it adequately. That night, after dinner, Alexander and Catherine walked through the mansion's gardens, seeking the privacy necessary for a conversation they both knew was inevitable. The temperature was pleasant, with a soft breeze that carried the aroma of spring flowers. The olive tree they had planted weeks ago already showed signs of taking root, its silvery leaves shining under the moonlight. "When would you have to give them an answer?" asked Alexander, breaking the silence. "In 3 weeks at the latest," responded Catherine. "The semester begins in 2 months." Alexander nodded, processing the information with the analytical part of his mind, while his heart resisted the implications. "Is it what you want?" he finally asked, stopping to look at her directly. "To return to your academic life, to your country?" Catherine held his gaze, with that mixture of vulnerability and strength that always disarmed him. "I want you to understand something, Alexander. My previous life wasn't a mistake I was escaping from. I loved my work, my research, the impact I could have on my students. Losing it suddenly was devastating." "I understand," he said, though part of him resisted accepting it completely. "But I also need you to understand this," continued Catherine, taking his hands in hers. "What I've found here, what we've built together, is not a temporary substitute or a second option. It's real, valuable, deeply meaningful to me." The silence that followed was charged with emotions not completely expressed, with fears barely articulated, with hopes that seemed fragile before the new situation. "I would never ask you to give up something so important to you," Alexander finally said, with a generosity that came from authentic love. "If this is what you need, we'll find a way to make it work." Catherine moved closer to him, resting her head on his chest, listening to the constant beat of his heart. "What if I could have both?" she murmured. "My work and this new life. There are options. Distance teaching part of the time, sabbatical periods, academic exchanges with local universities." Alexander embraced her more tightly, allowing himself to consider possibilities that before would have seemed unthinkable for the structured and controlling man he had been. "Together we'll find the way," he promised, softly kissing her forehead. "We don't have to decide everything tonight." The following days passed with a mixture of superficial normality and deep underlying uncertainty. Catherine continued with her educational responsibilities, helping the twins with their school projects, teaching them piano, sharing stories and traditions. But both she and Alexander were aware of the invisible clock that was running, bringing them closer to the moment when a decision would have to be made. Eleanor, always perceptive, noticed the tension, and finally got her brother to confide the situation to her during an afternoon they shared in the office, reviewing documents related to the restructuring of the company after Frank's forced departure. "You're terrified of losing her, aren't you?" she said directly, with that frankness that had always characterized their relationship. Alexander sighed, recognizing the futility of denying the evident to someone who knew him so well. "It's ironic," he admitted. "For years I built my life around the idea of absolute control, of eliminating unpredictable variables, and now I find myself completely vulnerable before a decision I cannot control." "True love always implies vulnerability," observed Eleanor. "It's the entry price, so to speak. If you want absolute certainties, stick with contracts and financial assets." "The problem is that I no longer want just that," confessed Alexander. "Or rather, it's no longer enough for me. After years of functioning on autopilot, I've remembered what it feels like to be truly alive, with all the joys and all the risks that entails." Eleanor smiled, recognizing in those words the profound transformation of her brother. "Have you considered that perhaps it doesn't have to be a binary choice?" she suggested. "The world is full of creative possibilities for those who dare to explore them. And both you and Catherine are people with resources, intelligence, and determination." That conversation planted a seed in Alexander's mind, a different approach to the dilemma they faced. Instead of seeing it as a problem to solve, he began to consider it as an opportunity to reimagine what could be possible when two people were truly committed to building a shared life. Meanwhile, Catherine faced her own internal reflections. One afternoon, while supervising the twins' piano practice, Daniel surprised her with an unexpected question. "Is it true you might leave soon?" The question, formulated with that direct childish innocence, caught her off guard. Catherine looked at the two children, who had stopped their practice and were observing her with worried expressions. "Who told you that?" she asked softly. "Nobody," responded Matthew. "But we heard Dad talking with Aunt Eleanor." He sounded sad. Catherine breathed deeply, remembering that children, especially those who had experienced significant losses, developed an acute sensitivity to signs of possible new abandonments. "I've received an offer to return to teach at the university where I worked before," she explained with honesty. "I'm considering different options." "Will you leave us like Miss Hoffman?" asked Daniel, with a tremble in his voice that broke Catherine's heart. "No, sweetheart," she responded, embracing them both. "Whatever happens, I'm not going to disappear from your lives. I promise. You're too important to me." "And Dad?" insisted Matthew, always attentive to emotional dynamics. "He's important to you too, right?" Catherine felt a wave of emotion at the direct question. "Very much," she confirmed, with an honesty the children deserved. "Your father is an extraordinary man, and what I feel for him is special. Very special." That conversation with the twins crystallized something in Catherine. The decision she faced wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal and affected people who had become essential in her life. She needed to seek a solution that honored both her vocation and the new bonds she had formed, that recognized both her past and her present and future. That night, after the children fell asleep, Catherine found Alexander in the library. He was reviewing old photo albums, including some of the images of the village he shared with Emily. "It's fascinating how our stories intertwine without us knowing," he commented upon noticing her presence. "You and Emily, from the same small community, you and I meeting in circumstances neither of us could have foreseen." Catherine sat beside him, observing the photographs with a mixture of nostalgia and appreciation. "Sometimes I think there's more design in the universe than we dare to recognize," she said softly. "Patterns we can only see in retrospect." Alexander closed the album, turning to look at her directly. "I've been thinking a lot about your academic offer and what it means to you, to us." "Me too," responded Catherine, "and I've reached some conclusions." "Would you allow me to speak first?" asked Alexander with an unusual intensity in his voice. "There's something I need to tell you." Catherine nodded, perceiving the importance of the moment. "Catherine, for almost 6 years I lived in a state of suspended animation. I existed, I functioned, I even succeeded according to certain external metrics. But I wasn't truly alive." He paused, searching for the precise words. "When you entered our lives, I first thought you were simply an unexpected variable, a factor that altered the perfect order I had built. But you were much more than that. You were a reminder of everything I had lost sight of: joy, spontaneity, the capacity to marvel, to connect, to feel." Catherine listened in silence, moved by the vulnerability shown by this usually so contained man. "I don't want to return to that state of half-living," continued Alexander, "and I know that asking you to renounce your vocation, your professional identity, would be an act of selfishness that would end up poisoning what we've built. So I have a different proposal." From his pocket he extracted a small object that shone in the lamplight, an old and ornate key. "What is this?" asked Catherine, confused. "It's the key to a house in your village," explained Alexander. "I bought it 2 weeks ago when I began to understand that we needed more options than a simple you stay or you go. It belonged to Emily's family, had been abandoned for years. I've restored it so it can be both a vacation home for us and a place where you can work part of the year if you accept the academic position." Catherine took the key with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the gesture and its implications. "Alexander, I don't know what to say. Say that you'll consider a future where you don't have to choose between your vocation and us," he responded, taking her hands. "A future where the children can know their mother's land, where you can resume your academic career, where I can learn to live beyond the confines I imposed on myself for so long." "And the company?" asked Catherine, always practical even in moments of intense emotion. "You've worked so hard to build it." "The company will still be there," responded Alexander with a smile, "but I've learned, thanks to you, that I don't need to personally control every aspect for it to function well. In fact, I'm considering a restructuring that would allow me more flexibility. Eleanor has expressed interest in becoming more involved, bringing her international experience." The implications of that proposal unfolded before Catherine like a panorama of possibilities she had never considered. A future that honored both her past and her present, that allowed integrating the different facets of her identity instead of sacrificing one for another. "I don't need an immediate answer," Alexander added softly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm willing to reimagine our life together, to find creative solutions that allow us both to grow without separating." Catherine looked at the key in her hand, a physical object that symbolized both a return and a new beginning. Then she raised her gaze to Alexander, this man who had transformed his rigidity into flexibility, his fear into courage, his control into trust. "I love you," she said simply, pronouncing for the first time the words that had been latent in every interaction of the past months. "And I believe that together we can build something beautiful, something that transcends the limitations we thought inevitable." Alexander drew her to him, sealing that promise with a kiss that tasted of possibilities, of shared futures, of second chances that neither had expected to find. The old key rested between them, a tangible bridge between past and future, between what was lost and what was found, between abandoned dreams and newly discovered ones. The journey to Catherine and Emily's native village was organized to coincide with the twins' school vacations. Eleanor decided to accompany them, postponing her international commitments to be part of that family expedition that promised to be both a return to the past and an exploration of the future. Alexander, accustomed to planning every detail with military precision, found a certain restlessness in the partially improvised nature of the trip. He hadn't booked the best hotels or hired exclusive guides, as he would have done in other times. Instead, they would follow Catherine's recommendations, stay in the recently restored house and discover the place through her eyes and memories. "Are you nervous?" asked Catherine the night before departure, as they finished preparing the luggage. "It's strange," admitted Alexander with a self-critical smile. "I've closed multi-million-dollar negotiations without feeling half the anxiety that this trip produces in me." "It's because numbers are predictable," observed Catherine softly. "Feelings aren't. And this trip is loaded with them, yours, mine, the children's. Even the memories of Emily we'll find there." Alexander nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Part of me fears it will be too much for the twins. We've never talked as much about Emily as in these last few months. And now they're going to be surrounded by her legacy, her history." "Children are more resilient than we think," responded Catherine. "And they're excited, Alexander. For them it's an adventure, a way to connect with a mother they barely consciously remember but deeply feel." Dawn found them at the airport, boarding a flight that would take them to a destination that meant different things for each of them. The twins, overflowing with childish enthusiasm, bombarded Catherine with questions about the village, its inhabitants, the traditions she had mentioned to them. Eleanor observed the dynamic with approval, occasionally exchanging complicit glances with her brother. During the flight, Alexander discreetly reviewed some documents he had brought with him, the final reports on the company's situation after Frank Harrison's departure. The transition had been complex but successful. The Monterey project, after an exhaustive revision, had resumed its course under new direction. Morgan Development's reputation had remained intact, and even strengthened by the transparency with which the crisis had been handled. "Work during vacation?" asked Eleanor, leaning over from the adjacent seat. "Final details," responded Alexander, putting away the documents. "I wanted to make sure everything is in order before disconnecting completely." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the effort it meant for her brother to even consider the idea of disconnecting completely. "You're changing, Alexander," she observed, "in a way that Mom and Dad would be proud to see. In a way that, I believe, is bringing you closer to the person you were always meant to be." The comment, unexpectedly emotional coming from his pragmatic sister, touched a sensitive fiber in Alexander. For an instant, he remembered his parents, his mother with her innate warmth and her capacity to make everyone around her feel special, his father with his unwavering work ethic, but also with that deep laugh he reserved for family moments. They had been gone for so long, a car accident when Alexander was barely 23 and Eleanor 19, that sometimes he forgot the balance they had modeled between professional success and emotional richness. Emily had been a reminder of those values, a connection with that part of himself that had remained dormant after the loss. And now Catherine, by a twist of fate that still seemed miraculous to him, continued that legacy in a completely new and unique way. Landing at the regional airport was only the beginning of a journey that continued by road, entering increasingly rural and picturesque landscapes. Finally, after almost 2 hours of driving among hills covered with olive groves and vineyards, the vehicle crowned a slope and the village appeared before them, a collection of white houses grouped around a century-old church with blue-tinged mountains as a backdrop. "It's exactly as I remembered it," murmured Catherine with a voice broken by emotion. "Smaller than it seems in memories, but the same." For the twins, accustomed to the urban environment and the comforts of the mansion, the village represented a completely new and fascinating territory. Their eyes registered every detail: the elderly conversing in the main square, children playing in narrow but safe streets, dogs wandering freely, pots overflowing with geraniums on balconies and windows. The house that Alexander had acquired and restored was situated on a quiet street near the square. It was a traditional 3-story construction, with thick walls that kept the interior cool even on the hottest days. The restoration work had respected the original structure while incorporating discreet modern comforts. The furniture, a mixture of recovered antique pieces and contemporary elements, created a welcoming atmosphere that invited inhabitation. "It's perfect," declared Catherine after touring it completely. "You've respected its spirit." "I had good local advisors," responded Alexander modestly. "Hand some old photographs of Emily's family as reference." The first week passed in a different rhythm than they were accustomed to, without strict schedules or predetermined agendas, allowing themselves to be guided by the natural rhythms of the village and by spontaneous discoveries. Catherine took them to significant places: the school where she had studied, the municipal library where she had discovered her love for literature, the small local museum that preserved the history and traditions of the region. A particularly memorable day was the visit to Emily's grandmother's old house. Although it had passed to other hands after her death, the current owners, upon learning who the visitors were, invited them in to tour the place. "My wife knew Mrs. Rosemary well," explained the current owner, an elderly man with kind gestures. "She always talked about her granddaughter, who had left for the capital, who had married an important businessman. She was very proud of her." For Alexander, touring those spaces where Emily had spent summers and holidays during her childhood was a moving experience. He could imagine her running through that garden, climbing those stairs, dreaming next to that window with views of the mountains. It was like discovering a piece of the puzzle that had been his wife, a dimension he had never fully known. The twins absorbed everything with that unique receptivity of childhood. They asked questions, established connections, incorporated new elements into their understanding of who their mother had been. Instead of saddening them, as Alexander had feared, That contact with Emily's past seemed to enrich them, providing them with roots they had yearned for, without knowing how to name them. One afternoon, while Catherine accompanied the children to an improvised traditional pottery class with a local artisan, Alexander and Eleanor took the opportunity to visit the nearby university, where Catherine had received the offer to reincorporate. The campus, modest but well-equipped, breathed that particular atmosphere of spaces dedicated to knowledge and reflection. "I can understand why she loves this place," commented Eleanor as they traversed the central gardens. "It has a special charm." "It's different than I imagined," admitted Alexander. "More intimate, personal. I can visualize her here, interacting with students, developing her research." They met with the dean of the faculty, who showed them the department where Catherine had worked and explained the nature of the position they were offering her. It was a prestigious post that recognized both her previous academic trajectory and the literary work she had continued developing even during her years away from the institution. "Her novel has generated much interest in literary circles," explained the dean. "The manuscript she sent as a sample of her current work promises to be an important piece." Alexander felt proud hearing those words, recognizing Catherine's talent validated by experts in the field. It was a reminder that the woman who had entered their lives as a housekeeper possessed dimensions and capacities that transcended any predefined role. Back at the house, they found Catherine and the twins preparing dinner with local products they had acquired at the village market. The domestic scene, so different from the formally served meals at the mansion, had a warmth that made Alexander smile. "How was the visit to the university?" asked Catherine while cutting fresh vegetables. "Impressive," responded Eleanor before Alexander could speak. "The dean practically described you as the next National Literature Prize winner." Catherine blushed, but Alexander noticed that she also straightened slightly, with a justified pride in the recognition of her achievements. "You exaggerate," she responded, although her smile betrayed her satisfaction. "But yes, it's a good department, with brilliant colleagues and interesting projects." That night, after Eleanor retired to her room and the twins finally succumbed to sleep after a day of activities, Alexander and Catherine sat in the small interior patio of the house. The starry sky above them seemed infinite, so different from the limited celestial panorama visible from the city. "I better understand now why this place is so important to you," said Alexander, serving 2 glasses of local wine. "It's not just nostalgia, it's belonging." Catherine nodded, receiving the glass with a smile. "It's curious how roots work," she reflected. "You can leave, build a complete life elsewhere, but that connection always remains, like an invisible thread that pulls at you when you least expect it. Is that what you feel now?" "That tug?" The question floated between them, more significant than the simple words suggested. Catherine considered her response carefully. "I feel many things," she finally said. "Gratitude for being able to reconnect with this part of me, nostalgia for what was and is no more, excitement for the possibilities that are opening. But above all," she paused, looking at him directly, "I feel certainty that regardless of the logistical arrangements we make, my home is where you and the children are." Alexander felt something expand in his chest, a mixture of relief and happiness that almost hurt in its intensity. "Throughout my adult life, I sought certainties in wrong places," he confessed, "in contracts, in properties, in structures I believed immutable. Now I understand that the only true certainty is what we feel for each other, what we build together each day." He leaned in to kiss her under that starry sky, sealing a promise that transcended geographies and circumstances. The decision that before seemed so complicated began to clarify. It wasn't about choosing between 2 mutually exclusive lives, but about weaving a new one where elements of both could coexist. The following days brought more discoveries, more connections, more puzzle pieces fitting into place. The twins, initially shy with the local children due to the language barrier, soon found the universal language of play and friendship. Alexander, always reserved in unfamiliar environments, surprised himself by participating in conversations with the village inhabitants, learning about local history, even allowing himself to be convinced to join an improvised football match in the square. Catherine visibly flourished in that environment, like a plant returning to its native soil. The sparkle in her eyes, the ease of her movements, the way she interacted with everyone revealed a dimension of her that could only fully manifest there. But Alexander noticed, with growing certainty, that fullness didn't exclude what they had built together. Catherine didn't seem to be choosing between two worlds, but integrating them into a more complete and authentic identity. The final decision was made during a particularly significant afternoon. They had visited the local cemetery, where several generations of Emily's family rested. The twins, far from being frightened or saddened, had shown surprising maturity, placing flowers on the graves of great-grandparents and great-uncles they had never known but who formed part of their lineage. Afterward, following a local tradition Catherine had explained to them, they had gone to the fountain in the main square. According to legend, throwing a coin while thinking of an absent loved one created a bridge between worlds, allowing their essence to remain close. "Do you think Mom sees us?" asked Daniel as he held his coin, preparing for the ritual. "I don't know with certainty," responded Alexander honestly, "but I believe that love doesn't simply disappear because the person is no longer physically present. Somehow it remains, like these traditions, like these stories you now know." The children threw their coins simultaneously, observing the concentric circles that formed in the crystalline water. Catherine and Eleanor imitated them, each with their own thoughts and wishes. Alexander was the last, closing his eyes for a moment before letting his coin fall. "Thank you," he thought, mentally addressing Emily, "for the time we had, for the wonderful children you gave us, for being part of my life. And if somehow you can see us, I hope you know that we're finding happiness again, in ways I couldn't have imagined." That night, gathered in the house's living room, while a summer storm beat the roofs with intense rain, they made decisions that would trace the course of their lives in the following months and years. Catherine would accept the academic position, beginning with a reduced load that would allow her to divide her time between the university and her role as the twins' tutor. The house in the village would serve as a secondary residence for the entire family, a place where they would spend vacations and longer periods during the summer. Alexander would reorganize his company to allow himself greater geographic flexibility, taking advantage of technology to stay connected when necessary. "It won't always be easy," acknowledged Alexander. "There will be logistical challenges, periods of adaptation, moments of doubt. But we'll face them together," completed Catherine, interlacing her fingers with his. "As a family." The word family resonated in the room with special force. It wasn't a conventional family, certainly. It had been forged in the crucible of losses and new beginnings, of improbable coincidences and brave choices. But it was authentic, built on foundations of mutual respect, genuine admiration, and a love that had slowly blossomed, maturing like a fine wine. "I like how that sounds," said Eleanor, raising her glass in an improvised toast. "To the families we choose, to the paths we find even when they seem impossible." The twins, although too young to understand all the implications, perceived the importance of the moment. They joined the toast with their juice glasses, smiling with that special intuition of children who recognize authentic happiness when they witness it. Outside, the storm continued. But inside that old house with new inhabitants, there reigned a calm that went beyond the absence of conflict. It was the serenity that arises when the right decisions are made for the right reasons, when the heart and mind finally find a common path. The return to the mansion after those revealing weeks in the village marked the beginning of a new phase. The preparations to implement the agreed changes were set in motion with Alexander's characteristic efficiency, now complemented by the creative flexibility he had learned from Catherine. The news that she was accepting the academic position, albeit with a special arrangement that would allow her to maintain her connection with the Morgan family, was received with diverse reactions. The university dean, understanding Catherine's personal situation, agreed to a personalized contract that divided her time between in-person teaching and research she could conduct remotely. The twins, initially concerned about the idea of changes in their routine, were reassured when they understood that Catherine would continue to be a constant part of their lives, albeit with some adaptations in the calendar and responsibilities. "You'll have a new tutor for some subjects when I'm at the university," Catherine explained to them during a family conversation in the garden. "But I'll continue to supervise your progress and I'll be present most of the time." "And will we live part of the year in the village?" asked Matthew, for whom the experience had been particularly significant. "That's exactly what we'll do," confirmed Alexander. We'll spend the complete summers there and some periods during the year, especially when they coincide with important dates for Catherine's work. The idea of dividing their life between two places, far from confusing the children, seemed to enthuse them. For them, it represented an expansion of their world, new experiences, additional friends, a tangible connection with their maternal roots. Eleanor, whose visit had extended much longer than initially planned, finally announced her plans to depart for her next international mission. "But it won't be like before," she assured during her farewell dinner. "I've discovered that family is too important to keep it in the background. They'll come more frequently. I'll be more present in your lives." Alexander's proposal for her to assume a more active role in the company, acting as an international liaison during her travels, had been received with enthusiasm. It was a way to integrate her passion for humanitarian work with the family and business structure. Another example of how apparent contradictions could be resolved with sufficient creativity and goodwill. The weeks passed with the intensity of periods of significant transition. Catherine divided her time between preparations for her partial return to academia and the continuation of her educational work with the twins. Alexander implemented structural changes in the company, delegating responsibilities he would have previously considered non-transferable, creating systems that would allow him to work efficiently, even at a distance. Catherine's novel, meanwhile, advanced towards its conclusion. The last pages were written in parallel to her own life, feeding on recent experiences, transforming reality into art and, in turn, allowing the creative process to illuminate aspects of existence that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. One especially significant afternoon, while the twins practiced piano in the main room, Alexander found Catherine in the library. She was seated by the window, reviewing what appeared to be the final version of her manuscript. "How's it going?" he asked, silently approaching. Catherine raised her gaze with that smile that always seemed to illuminate any room where she was. "Almost finished," she responded, pointing to the neatly stacked pages. "Just the final adjustments left, some transitions to polish." Alexander sat across from her, admiring the dedication with which she approached her creative work, the same commitment she showed in her work with the children, in her relationship with him, in every aspect of her life. "May I ask you something personal?" he said after a moment. "How does the story end?" Catherine looked at him curiously. "Do you mean the novel or our story?" "Both, I suppose," responded Alexander. "Although I know that in real-life stories never really end, they just evolve in new directions." Catherine nodded, appreciating the depth of his observation. "In the novel, the characters find a balance they hadn't considered possible," she explained. "It's not a perfect ending in the conventional sense. There are pending challenges, adjustments to make, continuous learning. But there is also a promise, a commitment to continue building together, day by day, conscious of both their fragility and their strength." "It sounds hopeful," commented Alexander. "And honest." "That's what I'm trying for," responded Catherine. "Honesty is the foundation of any story worth telling, whether on paper or in life." A complicit silence settled between them, one of those moments when words become superfluous because communication flows at a deeper level. From the main room came the notes of the piano, a melody the twins had composed inspired by their trip to the village. It wasn't technically perfect. It contained some dissonances, unexpected rhythm changes, transitions that defied conventions, but it possessed a vitality and authenticity that more than compensated for any formal imperfection. "It's like us," observed Alexander, listening attentively. "A composition in progress with its complexities and contradictions, but creating something unique in the process." Catherine smiled at the metaphor, recognizing its precision. The life they were building together was effectively like an unfinished symphony, structured but flexible with recurring themes and improvised variations, a delicate balance between the established score and personal interpretation. The sound of the telephone interrupted that moment of connection. It was a call from the university, confirming the final details of Catherine's contract and requesting her presence for a welcome ceremony the following week. "I suppose it's official now," she said, after hanging up, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Next week this new stage formally begins." Alexander approached, taking her hands in his. "It's not an isolated beginning," he said softly. "It's a continuation of what we're already building, another chapter of a larger story." Catherine nodded, comforted by that perspective that transformed what could have been a separation or rupture into a natural expansion, a mutual enrichment. That night, the family dinner had an air of anticipated celebration. Mrs. Jenkins had prepared some of the traditional dishes they had enjoyed in the village, combining them with elements of international cuisine that the twins had learned to appreciate thanks to their Aunt Eleanor's travel stories. The mansion, which in other times had seemed too large and cold, now vibrated with a warmth that transcended physical aspects. It wasn't the furniture or decoration that had substantially changed, but the emotional atmosphere, the quality of interactions, the authenticity of shared moments. As he observed his children animatedly conversing about their plans for the next trip to the village, Alexander reflected on the transformation they had experienced in little more than a year. From withdrawn and excessively formal children, they had blossomed into distinctive personalities, with their own interests, articulated opinions, the capacity to express both ideas and emotions. And he himself, how much had he changed? The man who had once confused control with security, who had built walls to protect himself from pain, who had relegated happiness to an abstract concept subordinated to material success, would barely recognize himself in the current Alexander. It wasn't that he had abandoned his responsibilities or his work ethic. He had simply found a healthier balance, a broader perspective on what truly constituted a full life. Catherine, as if perceiving the course of his thoughts, directed a look loaded with complicity from the other side of the table. No words were needed between them to communicate the essential: gratitude for having found each other, the commitment to continue growing together, the certainty that, regardless of the geographic or logistical challenges they faced, their hearts had found a mutual home. The following months passed in an alternating rhythm between the stability of routine and the excitement of new developments. Adaptation to the arrangement of a life shared between two locations presented predictable challenges and unexpected ones, but the Morgan family addressed them with a flexibility that would have been unthinkable a year before. Catherine had successfully integrated into the university, where her international experience and unique perspective made her a particularly valued professor. Her classes combined academic rigor with practical insights derived from her own experiences, creating an educational environment that transcended the merely theoretical. The twins, now 8 years old, thrived under the shared care of Catherine and a new tutor specially selected to complement her pedagogical methods during Catherine's temporary absences. Their academic progress was notable, but even more important was their emotional and social development. They had completely left behind the excessive timidity and withdrawal that had characterized them, transforming into secure, expressive, and emotionally intelligent children. Alexander had implemented substantial changes in the structure of Morgan Developments, delegating operational responsibilities to a trusted team and focusing his own participation on strategic decisions that could be efficiently managed even from a distance. The company had not only survived these adjustments, but was prospering, demonstrating that flexibility could be a commercial asset and not a weakness, as he had previously feared. The relationship between Catherine and Alexander continued to deepen, cemented in shared experiences, common values, and a mutual respect that transcended social conventions. They hadn't legally formalized their union, considering that the authenticity of their commitment was more significant than any official certificate, but in all practical and emotional aspects, they functioned as a consolidated couple. However, a pending matter began to manifest with increasing insistence: the need for a definitive conversation with the twins about the exact nature of the relationship between Catherine and their father. The children, with their natural intuition, clearly perceived the special bond between both adults, but the topic had never been explicitly addressed. The opportunity arose unexpectedly during a weekend in the village. They were visiting the local cemetery, where they had established the tradition of bringing flowers to the graves of Emily's ancestors, when Daniel posed a seemingly simple but meaning-laden question. If Catherine is from the same land as Mum, does it mean that somehow Mum sent her to take care of us? The question, formulated with the direct innocence of childhood, momentarily left the adults speechless. Alexander looked at Catherine, seeking her guidance in that delicate territory. "I think life sometimes works in mysterious ways," she finally responded, kneeling to be at the children's level. "I can't say if your mother sent me exactly, but I like to think there are connections that go beyond what we can rationally explain. What I can tell you with certainty is that I love you deeply, and that taking care of you is one of the greatest gifts life has given me." "Like a second mom?" asked Matthew, with that pragmatic precision that characterized him. Alexander intervened then, feeling it was his responsibility to directly address the topic they had been postponing. "Catherine is Catherine," he explained softly. "She doesn't replace your mother, whose place in our hearts is unique and irreplaceable. But yes, she loves us, and we love her in a way that makes her an essential part of our family." "Do you love her like you loved Mom?" insisted Daniel, always the most sensitive to emotional dynamics. Alexander took a moment to consider his response, aware of its importance. "Love has many forms," he finally said. "What I felt for your mother was unique and special, and will always be part of me. What I feel for Catherine is different, but equally profound and true. The human heart has a wonderful capacity to expand and embrace new loves without betraying previous ones." The twins assimilated these words with that reflective seriousness that sometimes made them seem much older than their 8 years. Finally, after an exchange of glances, Matthew spoke. "We like that Catherine is part of our family. She makes us happy. And you too, Dad. That's what's important, right?" The simplicity and wisdom of that conclusion deeply moved the adults. Catherine, with tears in her eyes, embraced both children simultaneously, while Alexander contemplated the scene with a mixture of pride and gratitude. That exchange, apparently casual but deeply significant, represented the last bridge they needed to cross to completely consolidate their new family reality. The spontaneous blessing of the twins, free from the emotional complexes that sometimes trap adults, opened the path for a shared future without reservations or pending doubts. That night, seated on the terrace of the village house under a starry sky that seemed to extend to infinity, Catherine and Alexander reflected on the path traveled and the one they still had ahead. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she commented, contemplating the village lights that descended the hillside until they were lost in the darkness of the valley. "For a little more than a year ago, I was cleaning your mansion without imagining all that destiny had prepared." "I don't think it was just destiny," responded Alexander, taking her hand. "It was our choices, our willingness to risk, to be vulnerable, to believe that we deserved a second chance at happiness." Catherine nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. Destiny could create circumstances, coincidences, opportunities. But it was human decisions, sometimes small and everyday, other times brave and transformative, that truly traced the course of a life. "Do you know what Daniel told me privately this afternoon, after our conversation in the cemetery?" commented Catherine, remembering a particularly moving moment. "He told me he had dreamed of Emily, that she smiled and told him that everything was all right now." Alexander felt a profound emotion at that revelation. He wasn't a particularly spiritual or mystical man, but he had learned to value those moments that transcended strict logic, that connected with something deeper and more mysterious in human experience. "I'd like to believe that's true," he finally said. "That somehow Emily approves of the path we've found." "We honor her memory every day," responded Catherine softly. "In the way we raise her children, in how we keep her traditions alive, in the respect with which we speak of her. There is no greater tribute than that." The silence that followed was charged with shared meaning, with emotions too profound to be completely articulated in words. Under that immense sky, with the village of their ancestors at their feet and the future extended before them like a path open to multiple possibilities, Catherine and Alexander silently sealed the commitment they had been building day by day, to continue advancing together, honoring both the past and the present, creating a family that wasn't defined by external conventions, but by the authenticity of its bonds. The last bridge had been crossed. What lay ahead was the daily challenge of living fully, of maintaining balance between different worlds and responsibilities, of continuing to grow individually while strengthening as a family unit. A challenge that, far from frightening them, filled them with anticipation and gratitude for the opportunity to face it together. A year after that definitive conversation in the cemetery, the Morgan Sullivan family prepared for a special occasion, the official presentation of Catherine's novel, finally published by a prestigious publishing house and received with enthusiasm by both critics and readers. The event would take place in the main square of the village, a space loaded with meaning for all of them. The local authorities, proud that a daughter of the community had achieved international recognition, had organized a celebration that combined the literary presentation with elements of the traditional festivals Catherine had described in her work. The house that Alexander had acquired and restored, initially conceived as a secondary residence, had gradually become the emotional center of the family. Although they maintained the mansion in the city for practical reasons related to the twins' schooling and Alexander's business commitments, it was in the village where everyone seemed to find a deeper connection, a rhythm of life more in accordance with their true priorities. The morning of the presentation, while the final preparations were developing in the square, Catherine found herself in her study. The space, originally a small room on the upper floor of the house, had been transformed into a creative sanctuary where she alternated between her academic responsibilities and her writing. From the window she could see the olive tree they had planted during their first visit, now visibly larger and more robust, a living symbol of the growth and rooting that characterized her current life. Alexander found her there, contemplatively looking at the copy of her novel that she held in her hands. Echoes of Silence, with its elegant cover showing an old house similar to the one they now inhabited, represented not only a professional achievement, but a testimony of the personal transformation she had experienced. "Ready for your big moment?" asked Alexander, approaching to embrace her from behind. Catherine leaned against him, grateful for his constant presence, for the security he transmitted even in moments of nervousness like that one. "It's strange," she confessed. "I've given academic conferences before hundreds of students without feeling this anxiety, but today it's different, more personal." "It's natural," responded Alexander with understanding. "You're sharing not only your work, but a part of your soul. And you're doing it in the place that saw you grow, before people who knew your story from the beginning." Catherine nodded, recognizing the precision of his words. The novel, although fictionalized, contained essences of her own experience, of the transformation she had experienced in her relationship with the Morgans, of the reunion with her roots after years of forced uprooting. "The twins are very excited," commented Alexander, slightly changing the subject. "They've been practicing the musical piece they composed for the occasion. They want it to be perfect." Catherine smiled at the mention of that special gesture. Matthew and Daniel, whose musical talent had flourished exponentially under the shared guidance of Catherine and a local teacher, had insisted on contributing to the celebration with an original composition inspired by themes from the novel. "They're extraordinary," she said with genuine maternal pride. "Sometimes I wonder who has learned more in this relationship, if them from me or me from them." "I think it's a perfectly balanced exchange," responded Alexander, "like everything best in life." The presentation in the square was a success that surpassed all expectations. The entire village seemed to have turned out to celebrate who they considered an ambassador of their culture, a prodigal daughter who had returned bringing with her not only her talent, but also a new family that enriched the community. Catherine, having overcome the initial anxiety, spoke eloquently about the creative process, about how loss and reunion had shaped both her life and her work, about the importance of roots and the human capacity to flourish even after the most devastating storms. The twins' musical performance provoked a spontaneous ovation. Their interpretation, technically impressive for their age but above all emotionally powerful, perfectly captured the essence of the book, the transition from silence to music, from solitude to connection, from fear to hope. During the subsequent reception, while Catherine signed copies and conversed with enthusiastic readers, Alexander found himself momentarily alone, observing the scene from a certain distance. The contrast with his previous life couldn't be more marked. The man who had once exclusively valued control, predictability, and success measured in material terms, now found his greatest satisfaction in moments like that. Seeing the woman he loved shine with her own light, his children develop talents and sensitivities that transcended any plan he could have designed for them, himself integrated into a community that valued traditions and human connections above individual achievements. Eleanor, who had traveled especially for the occasion, approached her brother with 2 glasses of local wine. "A penny for your thoughts," she said, offering him one of the glasses. Alexander smiled, accepting the drink. "I was thinking about circles," he responded. "About how life sometimes takes us exactly where we needed to be, even if by paths we would never have consciously chosen." Eleanor nodded, understanding the depth of that seemingly simple reflection. "You know, a few days ago I found an old photo of Mum and Dad," she commented, "from when we were little and spent summers in that coastal village. They had exactly the same expression I now see in you and Catherine when you observe the twins. That pride mixed with amazement, that happiness that transcends daily concerns." "I wish they had known them," said Alexander, referring both to Catherine and to his own children, too young when their grandparents passed away to keep significant memories of them. "I think in some way they do," responded Eleanor with an unusual softness in her typically pragmatic character. "Through the stories we tell about them, the values they transmitted to us and that you now pass on to your children. Circles complete themselves, Alexander, in ways that sometimes we can't see directly, but that are there." The celebration continued until nightfall, when literary traditions gave way to more festive elements. Folk music, traditional dances, local gastronomy shared at long tables arranged in the square. The twins, completely integrated into the community after so many visits, participated with enthusiasm, alternating between groups of local children and adults who treated them as their own. At one point in the evening, Catherine and Alexander found themselves dancing under the stars, swayed by an ancient melody that spoke of lost and found loves, of paths that separate only to reunite with greater strength. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, near her ear. Catherine moved slightly away to look him in the eyes, allowing him to see the complete truth in her gaze. "More than I thought possible after losing everything," she responded with simplicity. "It's not a perfect happiness, or without challenges. It's better than that. It's real, built day by day, conscious of both the fragility and the strength of what we have." Alexander nodded, recognizing in her words the echo of what she had described time ago when talking about the end of her novel. Life imitated art, which in turn had been born from life, in a perfectly complementary circle. In the distance, by the fountain where years ago they had thrown coins following the local tradition, the twins animatedly conversed with a group of village elders. Their crystalline laughter mixed with the voices worn by time, creating a harmony that perfectly symbolized the integration of past and present, of different generations, of stories that intertwine to create new meanings. The image was so perfect, so complete in its simplicity, that Alexander felt an almost overwhelming emotion. The man who had once built walls to protect himself from pain now allowed himself to be vulnerable before beauty, before happiness, before the infinite possibilities that opened when one dared to trust in life's process. "Sometimes," he murmured, more to himself than to Catherine, "the true miracle isn't in avoiding the storms, but in learning to dance in the rain." Catherine smiled, recognizing the depth of that seemingly simple observation. Together they continued dancing under the starry sky of that village that had welcomed them, surrounded by a community that celebrated not only a book or an author, but the human capacity to be reborn, to rebuild, to find meaning, even after the most devastating losses. The circles had completed themselves. The millionaire who had once been left speechless at the laughter of his children with the housekeeper by the pool, now danced with that same woman who had become an essential part of his life, while those children flourished in an environment of authentic love and unlimited possibilities. What had begun as a casual, almost accidental encounter had transformed into a story of redemption and renewal, a testimony that second chances exist for those who dare to recognize and embrace them. And most importantly, living proof that true wealth is never measured in bank accounts or material possessions, but in the depth of human connections, in the authenticity of shared feelings, in the courage to remain open to love even after having known the pain of loss. As the music continued and the night advanced, Alexander and Catherine kept dancing, anchors and sails simultaneously for each other, part of something larger than themselves, but also active creators of their own destiny. A destiny that, like the recently published novel, didn't really end with the last page but continued developing day after day, chapter after chapter, in the great unfinished narrative of life.